Joining me now to speak more on the matter is Michael Swain, who's the Executive Director of Freedom of Religion. Michael, good evening and welcome to News at Prime.
Good evening and thank you for having me.
Let's talk about what will be the legal argument that you will be putting forward for requesting the lifting on the ban.
The legal argument is essentially that the government has banned all faith-based gatherings. That means that whether it's a mosque, a synagogue, a church, whatever, even a cell group meeting in your home would be considered a faith-based gathering. Even sitting in a car with the windows closed on a church car park, listening to a sermon preached would be a faith-based gathering, and these have been banned. And yet at the same time, we see that other similar gatherings are actually permitted. So for example, you're allowed to go to a restaurant, you're allowed to go to a health club, you're allowed to go to a cinema or even a casino. And those are allowed, obviously with very important restrictions, and we appreciate and understand that. And at the same time, the faith-based gatherings are banned. And we are simply asking for the data, the scientific data that government is relying on to impose this ban, because, of course, it is an infringement of a very important fundamental constitutional right, which is freedom of religion. And this right has been essentially taken away, while areas of the economy, which actually have less constitutional protection, are allowed to continue. And we're simply saying that that is arguably unfair discrimination and therefore unconstitutional and possibly also irrational unless there's evidence to back it up. So that is the essence of why we are unfortunately having to go to court.
What is required under the Constitution, Michael, when it comes to governments posing such limitations on constitutional rights of religious organizations based on the fact that, of course, there are these circumstances that are prevailing where there is a pandemic right now?
Yes, government is entitled to limit any constitutional right. This is not a state of emergency when all constitutional rights are suspended. This is a state of national disaster. And therefore, under Section 36, they can limit any right, but it must always be equitable, it must be proportionate, it must be reasonable, it must be fit for purpose. And that is, again, why we're saying we do not understand why other similar gatherings are being allowed, and yet, for some reason, faith-based gatherings are not allowed. Let me give you an almost absurd example to illustrate the point. You and I are entitled to go to a casino. We can sit side by side, obviously suitably distanced and with correct sanitation and protocols in place, and we can play the slot machine. But if you and I subsequently then decide, maybe with a friend at another slot machine, let's now turn this into a prayer meeting, that would be illegal because that would then be a faith-based gathering. And we're simply saying we don't understand why it is more dangerous to sit side by side with somebody in a pew than it is to sit side by side with somebody in a casino. At face value, and I think you would agree, that doesn't make sense, and therefore potentially we believe it is unfairly discriminatory against the religious community, and therefore it is a breach, if you like, an unfair abrogation of our constitutional rights of religious freedom.
So, I mean, I don't speak for government, but I suppose they would want to make an argument here to say casinos, gyms, and the other places that you have mentioned are for economic reasons. Churches generally, in my understanding, do not exist for that. They exist for spiritual upliftment. There is God's will that is involved there. It's not an economic consideration. Am I correct?
You would be correct to a measure, but don't forget there is obviously an economic component to the religious community. Salaries have to be paid, buildings have to be paid, rates and taxes have to be paid. So there is an economic component, but I think what we must be very careful not to do is to simply put so much focus on livelihood that we also forget about lives. The idea is to find the balance between lives and livelihoods. And the reality is as well is that the religious sector has been and continues to be very much in the front line of the pandemic. This is the way that many people are receiving support, feeding, clothing, comfort, succor. Pastors and other religious leaders take place at funerals. Why are these things basically, I mean, funerals aren't banned, but why would it be therefore particularly egregious or particularly dangerous from an infection point of view to meet in a religious gathering rather than any one of these other gatherings? And what we're basically saying is the courts must now decide. The courts must review this so that we can see whether or not government's decision is reasonable and justifiable and in accordance with the requirements of the rule of law and the Constitution.
Are you possibly suggesting then, Michael, that devout believers in Christ are not giving at this time of a pandemic because of the in-person gathering being limited?
No, because I think people are able to give how they want to. So that isn't the issue. The issue isn't the economic value or not of the religious gathering or whatever religion that may happen to be. The issue here is the constitutionality of imposing what we believe is an unfair discriminatory ban on religious gatherings while allowing these other gatherings to take place.
Yeah. Are you simply rebelling against government because I suppose this matter has now become political? I mean, where do you derive your justification for this challenge?
The justification is purely a legal one. We believe that religious leaders, who, as I say, have been at the forefront of this pandemic, should be allowed to make the decision, frankly, on whether or not they should open their venue. Don't forget that just because you can open your venue doesn't mean to say that you have to open your venue. In fact, many religious gatherings have not taken place because religious leaders have decided to not open the venue and they've made that decision. But why should that decision be allowed, for example, by a restaurant owner and not by a religious leader? Why, for example, should you and I be allowed to make the decision whether or not we go and eat at that restaurant, but we're not allowed to make the decision whether or not we get together with a couple of friends for a prayer meeting? So this is not rebellion at all. This is just simply going and using a democratic process that is built into the democratic society that we live in, thank God, and simply asking the court at this point, having written multiple times and made multiple submissions to government and asked questions and received, frankly, not very sufficient answers, we need to now ask the court to please review this so that we can actually get a resolution. Because in the absence of certainty, and there isn't certainty around this issue, then obviously we need to find some level of certainty that, frankly, we believe only the courts at this stage can provide, unless and until government provides the data upon which it relies.
What will be the effect of this request? In simple terms, what is the risk that the church is taking in asking people to travel to and fro, whether it be 50, whether it be 100, during a time of a virus, considering that at times most churches have said that, well, the elderly must stay at home and only the ones with no comorbidities can travel. So you are now asking those to travel and essentially coming back and possibly with the potential of infecting those who are at home and who are elderly.
No, not at all. No, what we're saying is that they should at least have the right to decide whether or not to travel to a religious gathering in the same way that they can decide whether or not to travel to a restaurant, or to a health club, or to a casino for that matter. They should have the right to do so, to assess their own health risks in accordance with, obviously, the regulations. I mean, the regulations have been there, and the regulations on religious gatherings have been even more stringent than upon other gatherings. For example, there are obviously very critical health and sanitation measures. There are registrations, there are temperature checks, there's mask wearing at all times. So these have been very strict and very strictly observed. And if they aren't, then government can enforce those and should enforce those as they do on any other gathering or any other area of the regulations that it has imposed. But we're not by any manner or means saying that people have to attend. Of course they don't, but they should be allowed to make their own decisions based upon their own health risk assessment, as they do for these other areas.
Now, I do understand. So your argument is around the legality of the rules more than it is about the gatherings themselves, because one would also raise the question, Michael, to say, quite honestly, during a pandemic, churches have demonstrated that they are able to effectively gather without the in-person gathering being possible.
That is also true. But again, we have to think about the fact that in order to do so, you need data. In order to do so, you need technology. To get online to the platforms that many churches have been using is great. But of course, we have to remember that the very many people in this society, and particularly in this now devastated economy, simply don't have the means, don't have the money to afford the data. And small churches and perhaps disadvantaged areas don't have the technology to do so. So you're actually almost doubly disadvantaging people who live in the poorer communities by simply banning all religious gatherings from taking place.
So are you feeling, I mean, is there a sense and a feeling that government is possibly pushing the bounds and testing the religious freedoms of South African faith-based organizations?
We would certainly hope not. I mean, government constitutionally have a duty to uphold all constitutional rights. So I'm absolutely sure that that would not be in their minds. But it is, I think, nevertheless true to say that throughout this pandemic and from the beginning, the religious community does seem to have been treated somewhat differently from other sectors. For example, in the original lockdown levels, when they were announced back in March or April, there was no mention of religious workers or religious gatherings at all, which would mean that had we not perhaps then gone and protested that, we would not be allowed to meet at all until level 1 has passed. We'd have to be back to level 0. So government have been amending things and changing things, but the reality is that the religious community has unfortunately been a little bit late and last, perhaps, in government's consideration. Yeah. And we believe that this is also something which in principle we need to address and say, let's just have equality. Let's have equal treatment. This is a fundamental human right that we're talking about here. This is an essential component of someone's dignity and someone's literally being. So we believe that it should be fairly treated and equitably treated. We're not asking for anything special. We're simply asking that whatever standards are applied to these other sectors of society should equally be applied to the religious community as well. Michael
Swain, we appreciate you joining us tonight on News at Prime. As the Executive Director of Freedom of Religion South Africa, challenging this now in court, wanting the courts to pronounce on the legality of the ban on faith-based gatherings.